Hey friends, I'm Scott Hanselman. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I encourage you to subscribe, but make sure that you look at the previous videos. There's a ton of information here, so don't just subscribe and watch for new videos. There's a lot of good stuff going back many, many years. Also, you can do me the gift of sharing this channel with your friends if they think it's useful. I want to talk to you about an interesting software problem and a software design problem, a thing that happened in a real live site, and how I ended up solving it. I worked with a couple of people and asked friends for advice. This is about a beginner to an intermediate level problem. It's one of those things that's not a huge deal, but it was annoying, and I wanted to figure out a way to solve it with as minimal effort as possible. So I'll show you how it worked. We'll do it without any cuts as we try to do things real here. If anything goes wrong, it was all real. Now, if you want to catch up on the nitty-gritty details, I would encourage you to take a look at the episode that we did. It was called Pair Programming with Damian Edwards, where Damian sat down with me and we talked about the pros and cons of varying ways to write the underlying code for this. But let's break down the actual issue. All right, so I have a weekly video show called Azure Friday. For a long time, it was hosted at friday.azure.com. If you go to friday.azure.com, you will get now redirected to the Microsoft Documentations site. So rather than it being at this particular Azure website, it's now inside of Docs. That's outside of my pay grade. That's fine. And you go down here and you can see that I've got lots and lots of shows. There used to be about 700 shows. Now they've pared it down to just the latest material. The show is over 8 years old, so they've taken the stuff that they felt was out of date. So now we have 350. About half the shows are left. This was originally hosted on a website called Channel 9. And Channel 9 had an API that I could use if I wanted to that looked a little bit like this. I would say channel9.msdn.com/API/entries by area. I would pass in the ID of my show and then some format where that format might be give me JSON or give me XML. This is a real common thing. So here we have a web application that depends on a third-party web API, a RESTful API, where REST means representational state transfer, but ultimately it's just you do a GET and you get back some stuff. So it's a kind of a web database. And with my friend Oluwakorede Cole, we put together AzureFriday.com. Now, AzureFriday.com is a simple little web app. It doesn't really do anything, but I feel like it makes the Azure Friday experience better. So Olu went and made it so I can type here any kind of topic, and you see how nice that is. I just start typing, and then it filters, right? So we've got list.js, we've got all these shows, and again, it's coming from a database, right? Well, the database in this case is just that JSON file. So originally what we would do is we had this web app that would call the external web API. We'd cache it because we only come out with a show a couple times a week, and then we'd hold that in memory, and that makes the website really, really fast, and it's really cool. So let's talk about what that architecture would look like. I'm going to use this tool here that's called Remarkable, and I've got this e-ink display here. So I'm just going to kind of talk about this. Again, doing this a little bit more beginner level for our friends that are just early in career or getting started, right? So you've got some web browser. We've got our web browser here with our home and our URL. And this is going to show, Azure Friday AF, as the kids say. And that's going to call over to a web server, right? So this web server right now happens to be in Azure itself. Could be anywhere. This is HTTP, and that's going to go and write some code. That's got some C#, it's got some JavaScript. Now, traditionally, of course, this is going to go and talk to a database, right? When we think about classic design, it's going to talk to a database, and the DB would be right here. But I don't have a database. I don't have any, SQL servers or anything like that. So that database doesn't exist. Instead, my backend website is going to go and make another HTTP call off to another website. Now, in the previous iteration, that was at Channel 9, and it would return JSON. And that JSON was in a very friendly format. It was nice and simple. There's only several hundred of these shows, so we're talking about, I don't know, a half megabyte of JSON. Not a lot of information. Could have been JSON, could have been a text file, doesn't matter. titles, URLs, videos, thumbnails. It would look nice. And unfortunately, when that changed, things broke. So this goes away, and now the site says error loading. So then Azure Friday doesn't work anymore, and people suffer. So how do I do that? Well, first we got to figure out what is the API that's going to replace what we're going to do. There's got to be another API underneath that. So let's go back out of here and figure out what our API is going to look like in the future. Well, they gave me a new API. It says docs.microsoft.com/API shows /Azure Friday, and then things get interesting around here. We have paging going on. So rather than giving me all 351 shows, they will give me them at a maximum page size of 30. I tried putting in page size of 100 or 200 or 300. The maximum size is 30. And then I can have a little order by clause here where I can say, give me the new ones at the top. So then I look at my episodes here. We have an array of episodes. And I thought, oh, well, this isn't too bad, right? This is not too much of a problem. But then I realized I'm missing some stuff. I would have expected thumbnails, the video files themselves, more information. But all I'm getting back is title and URL. Now, if I were to go and request this JSON, 351 of them divided by 30 per page, 12 times, I could give you the title and the URL. But I want to show more. I want to get more. So I dug into that a little bit, and it turns out that we then need to go and call a separate details call and say, I want to get specific information for this, this particular show. And the details call, let me see if I can find that for you. Sorry, should have prepared. That was at API/video. So let's see if I have that. There we go. So here I am asking for the details of a particular video. So for each one of these videos, I can then get my video URLs, my audio URLs, my lengths, thumbnails. Things start getting more interesting. But now I'm thinking to myself, gosh, before I could just say, give me one JSON file and I'd get this magical dump that had everything that I needed. Now suddenly I have to page 12, 13, 14 times, depending on how many shows I have. And then I'm thinking, gosh, I'm going to have to call this 350 times for each. So my one HTTP call, which was very easy, has now become very chatty, right? So I had a very chunky call. I don't want to have my website make a call 350 times plus over to here. That thing starts getting weird. Now you can imagine, of course, that the user doesn't want to do that. Certainly I could be making those calls with JavaScript. Our new web database isn't Channel 9, but it's Microsoft Docs. Okay, I could cut out the middle person. This could become a static website here on the left, and Azure Friday could just call that directly. But is it really a good design to have those kind of chatty calls? We want to make 400 plus API calls from here. I would propose that we do not. So wouldn't it be nice if I could make this experience nice and clean, where I can retrieve for my website my single JSON file or a file that is shaped the way I want it, but I can't get Docs to change their API in the short term and my website's down. Well, so we dig into this a little bit and we discover that we can do batches. So first, it's not as bad as I thought. It looks like it will take 30 IDs at a time, so I can batch my way into this API. So now I need to go 350 divided by paging of 30, so that's 12, and then do an additional 12 batch calls to get details for everything, and then merge them together. So I'm making 24-ish, 25 calls where I used to make one. I still don't want to do that because it's not really the responsibility of my website to do that. It kind of makes me sad. So there's a couple of ways to do that. And by a couple, I mean 1,000 million ways. We could, at the time that our C# application starts up, call out and make 25 calls. Or if I have 1,000 episodes make 75 calls or 150 calls, right? These things are going to scale. That's reasonable. But wouldn't it be nice if I could make docs decoupled, and instead of calling another API, let's pretend we'll make some storage here. We'll have Azure Storage. We'll have a Blob Storage, and we'll have a JSON file that's shaped the way we want. We want our JSON file to live here, and it's going to be shaped the way that we want. But we know that we're going to have to call docs many times. We're going to have to call docs 25 whatever times. Maybe we have an Azure function, or what's called a serverless function, basically a cron job. A cron job is like a background job, a batch file in the cloud. It's a shell script in the cloud. That function will go and call docs and then dump the perfect JSON file that I want right there. So this function here, we only update the site once or twice a week, can run every couple of days. It could run every couple of hours. It doesn't really matter. It will do the work of shaping or projecting the shape of that JSON that the document website gives us, and it will drop it into Azure Storage into the format that I want. Azure Storage is a convenient place to put that because it's effectively free. It's incredibly cheap, and I can make that URL public, which then can be sucked into my website or a future app, which might be cool. And I've talked about maybe making a cross-platform podcasting app, or I could also use it to make RSS. So there's a lot of options. Once I get it into the shape that I want, I've given myself a nice layer of abstraction, a nice bit of separation between my data shape and my website. The other thing that's really significant is pointing out this idea that the site doesn't update that often. Do I need to do this in real time? Once an hour, once a day, once a week. You really have to ask yourself, how fresh does your data need to be? So this should just be a nice little simple architecture. Let's see what that would actually look like. So we saw the different shapes of our data. I'm not going to go through this in detail. You can go and take a look at that Damian Edwards show. This is just some C#. It's not the world's greatest C#, but it's clean enough for now. We've identified that main URL, that main style that goes and says, give me your episodes by page. And then we have that batch URL that takes n number of episodes, where n is a number under 30. And we're going to go and start with our HTTP client and our docs, which is our base URL, because that's what we're going to be calling. And we have a page number of 0 and a total count of 0 to start with. I don't actually think total count is, do I ever use it? I don't think I really do anything with it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an object called episode that is shaped the way I want it to be shaped. Okay, let's take a look at what an episode looks like. We'll just peek at that. It's a public record episode. Episodes have titles, they have a URL, they have a description. The description might be encoded, so it might be, might want to look at the description as HTML. Our descriptions are actually in Markdown, so I want to be able to get that Markdown back as HTML. So this is used, and this one is just a calculated property. We've got our entry ID, which is a unique number. We've got the upload date. And then we don't get the YouTube URL and the thumbnail URL until later. We have to go and do 2 passes. So we run through the whole main API, and we get our information about our episode. And then we have to go and run through later and then fill in the information we couldn't find before. All right, let's go ahead and close that. So this is an interesting way to do things. While true, meaning for some unknown amount of time, who knows how long this is going to take, we'll start with our episode URL. We'll grab that JSON. We'll let the console know that it's happening. We're going to parse that information out. And now we have this object right here called a JSON node. It's kind of a document that represents our JSON. And then we're going to go and grab that top value, that total count. Let's go back and remind ourselves what our JSON looks like. It looks like this. Okay. So we grab that total count right here. Total count, all right? Then we say on line 38, let's take a look at our episodes. Grab me this JSON object right here. What is this JSON object? This is an array And we're like, is this not an array? Is this an empty array? If there's anything going on here that looks weird, let's get out. Because we're going to do this while true. We're going to do this until that episode count comes back as something empty. See how episodes is empty if we ask for page 13? So that's how we know to stop. We're going to keep calling this API till it comes back empty. Okay. Then we're going to say for each of those items in the array, for each one of those items in the array, we're going to go and deserialize or take apart. We're going to take that JSON and turn it into an episode object. And we're going to throw that into our dictionary. We're going to throw that into our dictionary of episodes. And then because we're going to need to go and call details later, we're going to need to ask for details in our batch. We're going to go and append that here. We'll talk about that in a second. Now that we've got, in this case, the first 30 episodes, we're going to go and make our episode details URL. And then because we've been appending, we've gone entry ID, comma, entry ID, comma, entry ID, comma here, we're going to trim off that last comma because we know that there will always be one at the end. And then we'll go and we'll ask for the episode's detail URL. Okay. And then when we get that details URL, we're going to pull out our entry and our public video and our thumbnail. Let's go and remind ourselves of what that looks like. Here we go. Public video. I see we're going to get the 800 width URL. That's kind of a funky way to do it. I wouldn't have done it that way. And I'm going to grab the thumbnails and then the YouTube URL. In this case, this one's blank, but most of them are not blank. And I'm going to throw that in there. And then I'm going to keep track of the page that I'm on, and I'm going to keep doing that. So let's just zoom out for a second here. Not a lot of code here. While true, that's the chunk of code right there. While true. While true, do that. And then at the very end, when we get out, what we're going to do is we're going to take all of those episodes, I'm going to throw them into this list, taking all the episodes out of the dictionary that I could have sorted if I wanted to, and we're going to serialize it into a stream. Now, in this case, I went and I made this little 3-line file here because this function, this dump JSON from document, I wanted to be using in 2 places. I wanted to make a console app, an app that I can just type dump Azure Friday at the command line. And then later I wanted to be able to write an Azure function, a serverless function that we'll talk about in a second. So here I just open up the file. I have a file stream, and then I pass that stream, that chunk of memory, here to dump JSON from doc. I'm going to right click and say go to definition. And that's what we passed in. We passed in this output stream right here. And then at the very bottom, we said, hey, serialize this episode list as JSON, and then write it indented, meaning make it nice, make it indented and clean and pretty, rather than just make it ugly. And then we've got our episode here, and that's it. That's it. So let's see if we can run that console app real quick and see if it works. So I'm just going to hit Control F5. Everything works on the first try, right? And you can see it's making calls. It's going, and it just did that. It just went, bah, 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 bah. So that just made a whole bunch of HTTP calls. Let's go into our bin folder and see if that file is there. Dump.json. There we go. Let's go into code dump.json. We're going to open that up in VS Code. There you go. So that looks like what I wanted. We scroll all the way to the bottom. We've got 3,500 lines. So that's nice, clean, formatted JSON. And what's nice about it is it's got YouTube URLs, it's got thumbnails, it's got all the information that I would need, to put on a website that looks like this. Isn't that cool? Yay. I've got that on my local file system. So it's sitting in this folder. What I want to do is I want that to run on a schedule. I want that to run on a schedule somewhere in the cloud. So I'm going to make an Azure function. And Azure functions are super cheap. That's why I like them. They're on demand. It's not a website. It's an on-demand piece of code that runs as many times as you want it to run. So if I go to my Azure portal here, I go to function app. I can make a new one if I wanted to. I could say create function app and go through this, what do I want it to run on, .NET or Node or Python, whatever. Function apps can be anything. And then, when do I want it to run? So what I did is I made one that was going to run on a schedule. And I said the word cron job before. If I say cron job, right, a cron job is a job scheduler. And cron jobs have this format that's kind of funky looking, this format about 5 fields that describe how often something should run. So for example, this right here is a cron time string. It says run this command on the 15th of every month at 10 a.m. And this can be confusing on how to make these. So you can go and search in Google or Bing for cron format or cron maker. There's different websites that'll make it. Here you go. So you can go and say, all right, when do I want this to run? And I can change the numbers here, right? I can put in different things. Every minute past the hour at 3. Every minute on every day at 3, right? At minute 3, you can go and put these things in here however you want. It'll tell you when to go and run that stuff, okay? So that's a cron. And again, typically in historical systems and Unix-based system, that just means run a job, in the background. You would tell your machine to do that, but we're going to do it in the cloud, okay? So in my my application here, let's go back to my app. Go into my app. That is all I had to do to make a Azure function. So I have a function here called Azure Docs to Azure Function JSON, and it runs. It's got a function called run async in this case. And here's that cron string right there, right? And we could go and take that if we wanted to, put that into here. See, now it's gonna run at 3 a.m. So every day at 3 a.m. And in this case, it'll also run on startup. Now, they don't recommend that you run things on startup, but depending on whether you care how often the thing runs. In this case, the problem with run on startup is that you don't really control the time. It's going to run at 3 a.m. and anytime your app gets recycled or anytime your app gets moved around or anytime it starts up at all. I like that for debugging, but they do recommend that you set that to false. Passes in a logger and then a blob, an Azure Storage blob. Azure Storage is like S3, you're familiar with that idea of like a disk drive in the cloud. So I've got the Azure Storage Explorer here, which you can download for free, and it lets you access your storage blobs. And I've got storage here called Hansel Storage, and I've got a folder here called Output, or a container called Output. And inside that output, I've got that Azure Friday blob that I want created, that Azure Friday blob. And I want to right click on that and say copy URL to show you that that works. Because if I hit Hansel storage dot blah, 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 I want to be able to retrieve that JSON. I want to be able to retrieve that JSON. Why is that important? Why is that important? Because remember, this right here is going to be Azure Storage. So Azure Storage is going to hold that JSON and allow me to go and get it with HTTP, okay? So I can go and hit enter, and there I can get that information, right? So that's my dump file. How did it get there? Well, we want to have our application run, and then Azure Functions passes in a variable that's been configured for me. Rather than me having to remember connection strings or permissions or log into stuff, I just get this connection string, I set it up in the configuration, it doesn't go anywhere in the code, it's not in the C# here, and they're going to pass in this blob client here, and that blob client has a function called upload. I'm just going to pass it my stream, and I'm going to pass it some headers because I'm telling it that we're going to be using JSON, we're going to be uploading JSON, and then remember that I made that little function called dump JSON. I'm going to pass in this stream. Now this is kind of silly. If you're an advanced person, you could just pass the stream directly into the Azure Functions. This would change here from blob to just pass in a stream. And then you would end up with what's called, you'd end up with the wrong content type. You'd end up with what application/octet stream. I want mine to be application/JSON. A little bit advanced, but there's a reason for doing this. I think that this could be cleaned up. So if there's any suggestions, drop them in the chat here. Okay, so when I run this locally, I'm not going to run a console application. I'm going to pretend that I'm running a Azure function. I'm simulating an Azure function on my local machine. This comes with the tooling. So you see here it says Azure Functions Core Tools. It's a host. It's running my serverless function here locally, which is cool. That means I can do Azure Functions development on an airplane or in a low bandwidth environment. And then once I know that it works, I can upload it. So here we've got, it was invoked, running on startup, has a timer function that was just executed, and then that succeeded. So now that I know that that works, I can go into Visual Studio here and I can do one of two things. I could either publish this directly from Visual Studio, which I'll do for our demo here. I'll just click publish, or I could use GitHub Actions, or I could use Azure DevOps, where I would check the code in and it would automatically deploy to the function. But for the purposes of what we're doing right here, I'm going to go and hit publish, and all this is going to do is going to zip this code up and put it up into the cloud. Okay, and then I mentioned before that I don't have to think about the connection string. It's going to come out of a configuration option that's up there in the portal. Okay, so right now we're publishing this. We're going to be publishing it to Linux. Now, what's great about functions, again, is that they are incredibly cheap because you're only paying for when it's running. So I'm only going to pay a couple of pennies every day at 3 in the morning when this thing runs. And honestly, it only needs to run twice a week, maybe. So now it's going to go and upload that zip file up to this location using zip deploy. Don't feel bad that I'm doing this directly from my computer, from Visual Studio. This is part of the process. Once I get this working perfectly, then I will go up and I'll make it continuous, where it'll be coming directly out of my my GitHub. Okay, so they've successfully restarted the function app, and remember that I've got mine currently set to run on startup. So why don't we go over to the Azure portal, and then I'm going to click on functions. You can see my functions right here. And then let's see if we can make this a little easier to see. There we go. See right here, it says code and test. Code and test. You can actually see the execution count. See successful execution counts. I can click on code and test. When I click on code and test here, we can see that it's received that information about the cron, that it's on a timer, that it's running on startup. You can see the DLL, the library that it's using. And then I can click, even if I want to, test and run, and I could run it from here, which is really cool. So I could run that from here if I wanted to. And then if I'm having trouble with it, I could go and look at my invocations under monitor. You can see me getting it working, and it didn't work. And you can see these ones here were successful. So I can see each of the times that it succeeded. Click on that and see exactly what's going on. Then I can prove that it worked by going back over here into the Storage Explorer and hitting refresh, and I'll watch the time modified just changed to 7:30 instead of 2 o'clock when it ran the last time. So now that file has the stuff that I need in it. Now when I return to my website, I hit refresh, that's loading out of that JSON. Now that's going to be cached and it's going to sit here, but folks can then go and look for, whatever makes them happy. Here are all the shows on Linux, or all the shows on Cosmos or whatever, and I can go and click on those. And then once I do that, those are going to take me off into the actual place where I can watch that show. So this way I didn't have to change my website. I have one API on the left, which has changed, another on the right, and I've got a decoupled system that is set up pretty cleanly. I don't know if it looks like it's pretty clean from this messy bit of boxes and lines, but I think you get the general idea. Now, lots of ways to have done this. Could have been a background task or a background worker that was being done in C# and in ASP.NET. Could have been a logic app, an Azure logic app, or a Power App or a Flow. It could have been a batch file that I ran on my own computer and uploaded directly. Lots and lots of ways to solve these kind of problems, but this is the kind of thinking, and you'll notice that most of this thinking wasn't writing code. It was trade-offs about availability and error handling and shape of the data and how the data moves around. But the website is up and it's fixed, and the next thing I'll do is fix the podcast site. So again, please do subscribe and also take a look at the writing of this chunk of code that I did with Damien, which is a lot of fun. And then also big thanks to Jeff Holland for helping me fix a couple of small problems. That one thing I did want to mention that I mentioned briefly, this idea of the content type. Let me show you that very, very briefly here. If we go and grab this Hansel storage output, this is that final Azure Friday.json. That file is being retrieved from Azure Storage, and we can actually click on it and look at the response headers here. I can see there's the request, and I'm looking for the response headers that you're all going to point to immediately, and I'm not going to see. Where is it? Don't embarrass me at the end of the show. I'm going to have to edit this, kids. Everyone's screaming. It's right there. Let's try it from here. Headers, headers, headers. Show document info, -- head. There we go. It was probably over there. I just didn't see it. I'm going to go and request that, and it comes back as application/JSON. If I asked for an image, it would come back as, image/PNG or image/GIF. In this case here, these are standard headers, and then these are some Microsoft headers that you can see that it's a blob. Okay, so that was super important to me. Anyway, if this was enjoyable to you, I would encourage you to pass it on to your friends, and I appreciate you, as always, hanging out with me today. Please do subscribe and let me know in the comments what kinds of content you would like to see. Bye-bye.